Clause 6 of ISO 45001 is probably one of the most complex clauses within the standard. Join us for this session of ISO 45001 in 45 minutes as we give you tips on how to comply with this particular clause. Please hit the subscribe button if you would like to receive more information from us on how to meet the various different compliance standards. Hi, and welcome to ISO 45001 in 45 minutes. In this session, we're going to be looking at Clause 6, which is entitled Planning. In Clause 6.1, we want to look at risks and opportunities. The big idea here is that we've already identified internal and external risks and opportunities or threats to the management system or the organization and its ability to achieve its intended outcomes. We've identified those issues in Clause 4.1. We've identified the needs and expectations of workers, interested parties, their representatives. We've also looked at the scope of the organization. So in Clause 6.1, we want to take those issues that we've identified and we want to assess the risks because we want to provide assurance that the management system can achieve its intended outcomes. Some of the key issues to consider here are the terms OSH risks and OSH opportunities. Where you see the term OSH, it's referring to risks to human beings. Where you see the term other risks or other opportunities, they're talking about threats to the management system or the organization and its ability to achieve the intended outcomes for the occupational health and safety management system. Moving over to Clause 6.1.2, I normally refer to this as the operational risk assessment because in general, what's at risk here is the human being, but also there are opportunities to improve the human being's working conditions. So some of the big issues to consider here is you want to identify hazards for all of your activities, products, services, substances, plant and equipment. There's also a new focus on a lot of the psychosocial issues such as violence, bullying, intimidation. Hazards and risks associated with the design, installation and layout of your facilities. So here we want to look at not just hazards and risks, but we also want to look at OSH opportunities, those opportunities to improve the working conditions, the working environment for the human being. Moving over to Clause 6.1.3, which is legal and other requirements. Here, according to your activities, products, services, and substances that you have in your organization, they may attract legal requirements or other requirements. Other requirements are those issues that your organization will ascribe to. ISO 45001 would be an example of an other requirement. So here we've put a brief example of a legal register in place, which is what a lot of organizations utilize to demonstrate that they have identified all applicable legal and other requirements. The big ideas here are what you've identified in Clause 4 is pulled through into Clause 6. And obviously you're going to use this information that you've identified from legal and other requirements to help you define your operational controls. Because in many cases, the legislation may define what hierarchy of controls you are required to apply. Moving on to Clause 6.1.4. Now this is a newer clause and I really like it personally. The big idea here is the standard is saying stop and think before you take action. So on the back end of some of those issues that you've identified in previous clauses in Clause 6, risks and opportunities, legal and other, and also emergency situations that you might have identified in your risk assessments, stop and think before you take action. If you've identified some issues that require action, consider the hierarchy of controls from eliminate, substitute, engineering, administrative, all the way down to PPE controls. Consider the hierarchy of controls before you take action. Consider technology, best practice, resources, operational and business requirements before you pull any of those actions through to objectives or processes or whatever it is that you're going to use to control those particular hazards and risks. Moving through to 6.2, which is OSH objectives. Now remember, when you set objectives, they need to be consistent with the health and safety policy. They need to be measurable. You must consider the results of risks and opportunities and also the consultation and participation of workers or their representatives. Objectives must be monitored, they must be communicated, and they must be appropriate. But when we're setting objectives and drawing it through to a management plan, we need to remember the what, when, where, how, and who of the objectives. So there's just a brief example of a way that you can pull those objectives through to a management plan which details the issues, the objectives, the responsible person, the measurables, the targets, the programs that you're going to utilize to achieve the objectives, the resources required, target dates, responsible person for the program, any particular constraints. And just remember that you're going to need to report, particularly in your management reviews, on the status of your objectives. So it's always good to have a percentage complete and also your status progress. So moving on to some of the big concepts of Clause 6. So you can see there's Clause 6. The way that I would consider developing it is having a process for 611, risks and opportunities, having another process for 612, which is your operational risk assessment. Some of the outworkings of Clause 611 could be a strategic risk and opportunities assessment, where you're looking at those internal and external issues, your scope issues, and whether they create strategic risks to your organizational management system. 612, your operational risk assessment. There I would pull that out possibly to a baseline, issue-based risk assessment, your FAPES as they use in the mines, and also your continuous risk assessment as strategies that you can utilize to deploy to meet the requirements of 612. Also, you'd have possibly a legal register, which defines all of your legal and other requirements. There, I generally integrate clauses 614 and 62 together so that the planning to take action and setting objectives is actually linked. So some of the inputs there is your risk register, your legal register, resources and competencies, and those can be pulled through to an objectives and plan. Now, I generally like to integrate planning of changes or change management into 613, despite the fact that it sits in Clause 8. I like to link it directly through to the risk assessments. I place change management over here, which will pull through to the change risk registers, and then also larger project plans. So ladies and gents, that's an overview of Clause 6 for ISO 45001 in 45 minutes.